Good day. Shortly before my timing in making this video, the announcement came through on the official Russian news agency TASS that President Putin has now signed into law the treaty incorporating the four regions Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson, formerly parts of Ukraine, into the Russian Federation. So, as of this time, from today, in Russian eyes, these territories are now part of Russia. Now, all of this continues to happen in the context of a rather eerie calm. There were some expectations that after signing this law, President Putin would address the nation, but his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has denied this. And there were also some further expectations that some kind of ultimatum would be sent to Ukraine. After all, these territories, officially, in Russian terms, are now a part of the Russian Federation, and Ukrainian attacks on these territories, therefore, in theory now, or at least not in theory, in legal terms, from a Russian point of view, are aggression against Russia. Well, again, there's been no sign of such an ultimatum at the moment. One still gets a sense of an eerie calm. There's some talk also that President Putin is going to meet with his top military advisors in Russia's Security Council, and we'll see whether that does indeed happen. I'm going to say something straight away. As that law was signed today, the news that the Russian public is getting from the battlefronts is, to use a Russian euphemism, difficult. Now, for the moment, the situation in the Kharkiv Donbass region, the northern Donbass region, seems to be comparatively stable. I say that there's been all kinds of reports of advances by one side. Yesterday there were claims by the Ukrainians that they had made some advances into northern Lugansk. The militia conversely claimed that a Ukrainian force had been surrounded and destroyed. I can't confirm any of that, and from what I can tell, the situation seems to be, on balance, relatively stable. However, the situation in Kherson region, has now, from a Russian point of view, taken a significant turn for the worse. Now, this has been something of a surprise, at least to me, because up to now, the Russians have been extremely successful in defending their gains in Kherson region. The Ukrainians have launched multiple attacks in many places along Kherson region. Every single one of them has been repelled with extremely heavy losses. But over the weekend, the Ukrainians launched a tank advance along the main road, the asphalt road, all the way down to a village called Duchani, where they were blocked by the Russians after a bridge there was blown up, and it was said that this created difficult water barriers which would be very problematic for the Ukrainians to cross. And it does indeed seem to be the case that that armoured column that was advancing towards, I suspect, Berislav, seems to have ground to a stop. And there were some expectations that after that, the Russian Air Force and the Russian artillery would work to destroy this particular armoured column. And there was even some talk in some places of a Russian counteroffensive to basically drive this force back to its start points. And that there was talk about tanks being sent to conduct this offensive. Well, nothing like that happened. And whilst it does seem that there have been artillery and air attacks on this convoy, this column, which remains essentially on the asphalt road. Instead of counterattacking, the Russian military did something extremely unexpected, and from the perspective, I suspect, of a Russian electorate, which is following this war closely, very, very disappointing and even alarming, which is that they pulled their forces back from the Ingulets River. Now, that means that they gave up places like Davidov Brod, where the Ukrainians have been repeatedly making attacks, trying to ford Davidov Brod and advance into Kherson region, and have been repeatedly repelled and defeated. There was a heavy Ukrainian defeat in that precise area over the weekend, exactly at the same time as this armoured column was advancing towards Duran. And it also means that that area of the salient, which was created around Andriivka, where the Ukrainians have suffered extremely heavy losses as they've tried to send in troops into that particular bridgehead, only to be hammered by Russian artillery and hammered by Russian aircraft. Well, that area has been abandoned as well. And we're told that this was done in order to prevent Russian forces in the area of the Ingulets River from becoming surrounded as a result of what might have been a strike by this armoured column at Luchani, and that was why these forces had to be pulled back, and that a new, shorter, stabler defence line has been created. Still, it must be said, a long distance from places like Novaya Kakhovka, Berislav, Kherson, and the rest, and this has supposedly halved the length of Russian defence lines in this area, and supposedly this defence line is more stable. Well, all I can say about that is that is an explanation, but once more, it's an explanation that it's not been provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense. It's been provided by various Russian bloggers, and it is, from a Russian point of view, another defeat, another retreat. What the Ukrainians have captured up to this point is essentially empty steppe land. There are various villages and settlements there, but by most accounts, most of these are deserted, and none of them is particularly large. We're not talking about any towns or cities or anything like that, but it is nonetheless a retreat, and it is one which is visible on the maps. And once again, the Russian Defense Ministry is providing essentially no explanation of what it is doing or why what has happened has happened. Now, there may be all kinds of explanations for this. There was an interesting article, again, in the Financial Times, which again spoke about the imperative importance for Ukraine to capture Kherson this autumn, and about the difficulties of doing so because of the change in the weather and the fact that the steppe lands are now going to become muddy and armoured offensives are becoming extremely difficult, will become extremely difficult over the period of the autumn mud. I would say that the Financial Times article was extremely vague, very muddled about the timeline. It seemed to think that Ukraine has up to mid-November to capture Kherson city before the mud becomes really difficult in this area. My understanding is that it's a lot earlier than that. It's October, and that on the contrary, it is in mid-November that the ground starts to harden and tank offensives once more begin to become more possible. But, maybe I've got this wrong. I'm not a climatologist. I'm not familiar with the climate here. What I do hear is that there's been quite a lot of rain now, and that the conditions are becoming increasingly foggy all across the Ukrainian battlefields, and that this is starting to have an effect on military operations. Well, it could be, this is just my guess, that the Russians have pulled back because with the soil turning muddy and soft, it's becoming more difficult for them to keep their people supplied along the Ingulets River. Those forces were always to some extent isolated from each other. Creating a continuous defense line in the way that they've now done might be easier to sustain. And it could be that with the mud, the autumn mud, the Ukrainian offensive is going to lose steam in Kherson region. Well, that's one possible explanation. There's also been, it must be said, endless reports from the ground that once again Russian troops in this area are thin on the ground. There just weren't enough of them either to hold back this armoured column, even though I should say it wasn't especially big. Apparently one reinforced battalion, 150 armoured vehicles altogether, of which about 40 were tanks. One would have thought that there were Russian forces. Apparently there are large Russian forces in Crimea and even in Zaporozhye region and perhaps even in Kherson. One would have thought that there would be more than enough forces available to repel an attack of this kind by a force of perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 men, perhaps not even that many. But, as I said, it didn't happen, and nor was there a counterattack against it. So that does beg questions, and if it's true that the Russian forces in this area are indeed outnumbered, then it does beg the question of how many Russian forces there actually are defending this important area of Kherson region. Perhaps the Russians have thinned their forces in Kherson region because with the coming of the autumn mud, they don't think Ukraine can conduct further advances here. I don't know. But what I will say is this advance by Ukraine is again creating alarm in Russia and amongst the Russian blogging community. And there's even some talk that this advance might portend the abandonment of the entire Russian bridgehead west of the Dnieper River, which would of course include Kherson city itself. Now I have to say, if that does happen, that will be a massive political blow to President Putin and his government in Moscow, and it would, I think, trigger serious complaints, very serious complaints about how the war is conducted, and it might indeed lead even to criticism, in fact direct criticism, of President Putin himself. Now, in fact, the political consequences of this would be so bad that I think that President Putin might, for the first time since essentially the arrest back in, I think, 2002 of the Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, when he consolidated his political position in Russia. It will be the first time since then that Putin might start to look politically vulnerable in Russia itself. And one wonders whether he understands that, and when I wonder whether he also understands fully what is at stake for him personally and for the government he leads in Kherson region. Now, I say that because I've been piecing through Russian opinion polls, and what they show is large majorities still supporting the special operation in Ukraine, over 70 to 75%, or at least 70 to 75%, that's the range. And even bigger majorities, interestingly enough, calling for supporting the supporting the inclusion of the four regions into Russia, and the protecting the population of these regions. It seems to be hovering around 80%. Now, I should say these opinion polling data comes from ETHEREUM, which is a Russian state-owned opinion polling agency. But overall, and I've followed Russian opinion polling practices for many years, I found that ETHEREUM's polling seems to track fairly closely, correlate fairly closely, both with Russian election results, for what that's worth, but also with the polling of an entirely different polling agency, which is Levada, which, by contrast, tends to favour strongly Russia's vehemently anti-Putin liberal opposition. So I have no reason to doubt that this polling from ETHEREUM is correct. And interestingly enough, ETHEREUM suggests that there is a core of people, around 10% appearing in the opinion polls, who oppose the special operation, who oppose the incorporation of the territories into Russia, who oppose taking steps to protect the people there. And that again correlates fairly closely with what one senses is the extent of liberal sentiment in Russia, though I would stress liberal sentiment extends beyond support for the various liberal parties, which in Russia is considerably less than that. So that means that, there is solid support for the incorporation of these regions into Russia. Now, that may sound like it is reassuring for President Putin. It gives the appearance that there is a lot of support for him in Russia itself and for what he's been doing. And that is absolutely true. But if you think through the implications of that, consider what would happen if one of these four regions, Kherson, were to be recaptured by the Ukrainians. I think there would be an awful lot of very angry people. They would say, what has Putin been doing? Why has he acted in this way, allowing Russian territory to be captured by the enemy in that kind of fashion? And I think that 80% support, which you could say Putin has at the moment, is highly conditional on his eventual success in this war. Now, I say all of that because Putin can spring all kinds of surprises, but at the moment, there still seems to be a strange lack of urgency, or so it appears, about the situation in Ukraine, in the battlefields, and I wonder to what extent this can last. I've, by the way, seen one suggestion that Putin has mistimed these events, that the best time to have ordered partial mobilization in Russia was after the capture of Lysychansk back in July. When that happened, the Russians could have called up hundreds of thousands of men, as they've now done, and they would have been called up at a time when things were going obviously well and where there was a mood of victory. And that might have been received rather enthusiastically. Now, I've discussed in previous programs, many previous programs, why that didn't happen and what the political reasons for that might have been. But what I would say is that those political reasons may have been entirely valid. It does give the impression that the mobilization that's being carried out now is being carried out in a period of crisis and in response to Ukrainian battlefield successes, which may not be an entirely good look for Putin with the Russian population. Anyway, that's how things look on the battlefields at the moment. As of the making of this video, the situation in Kherson region and in Kharkiv region, I have to say, does look stable. We'll see how long that stability lasts, what it even means, and we'll see whether all that we've been hearing, including from the Financial Times now, about the intervention of General Autumn, how relevant and true that turns out to be, and whether it does indeed, as so many people have said, bring military operations in this place to an essential standstill. Anyway, we will see, and I can do no better than say that. Now, I would just finish by saying that there's been a cascade of reports that Ukraine has been stripping other areas of its battlefronts of troops in order to commit them to these offensives in Kherson region and in Kharkiv region. And in particular, there's accumulating reports that troops have been withdrawn from the central Donbass, from places like Bakhmut and the area around Donetsk city, to reinforce Ukrainian advances elsewhere. And that this is now leaving large parts of the front line overextended. So just as Russia was, as is now clear, overextended with too few troops in many places at the start of September, Ukraine is now in danger of finding itself in the same predicament over the next few weeks, perhaps as winter closes in. And it is indeed the case that over the last few days, there does seem to have been a significant quickening of the tempo in operations by the Wagner Group in and around Bakhmut city, and also by the Donetsk militia in the area around Donetsk city. They seem to be gaining ground significantly more quickly than they were just a few weeks ago. And there's also been suggestions that the front lines, the border areas around places like Chernihiv and Sumy, and have also in the north, have also been stripped of troops to support these offensives in other places. And there were also reports that there's heavy rail traffic now moving through from Russia into Belarus, and that perhaps some kind of strike from the north might be in preparation again. I can't confirm any of this. One thing I can confirm, or at least partly confirm, is that there's a report that, or rather there's been a report on Ukrainian channels that British intelligence has warned the Ukrainian command not to push forward too fast in Kharkiv region or in northern Donbass, because there's a very heavy concentration of Russian forces now gathering in Belgorod region, which borders Kharkiv, and that this could be poised to launch a counterattack, cutting off Ukrainian supply lines, which are becoming apparently rather stretched as the Ukrainians try to press on with their advance. Now, about the existence of this large force in Belgorod, or at least about the British claims about the existence of this large force in Belgorod, about that I have absolutely no doubt, because there's been repeated coverage of this in the British media itself. All I would say is, up to this time, this force, which has been building up in Belgorod for some time now, has been standing still. I mean, I presume the troops are training. I presume things are being organized and planned there, but it hasn't so far taken any actual offensive action. And apparently there are also very large forces, Russian forces concentrated in Crimea. And again, those have taken no action at the moment. And the Pentagon recently gave a report out saying that they were not seeing any sign of Russian forces in Crimea or in elsewhere from Russia being moved forward to the battlefields to reinforce positions anywhere. Which, again, given what's been happening on the battlefields, to someone entirely ignorant of military affairs, or at least entirely ignorant as I was before the start of this war, does seem a bit strange. I mean, it does seem odd that you should keep so many of your forces in reserve, hold them back, even whilst the situation on the battlefronts deteriorates. Maybe, presumably, there is a plan, but we'll have to wait and see what that is, because for the moment, there's not much sign of it, some visible sign of it on the ground. Anyway, that's where we are on the battlefields to the best that I can see today. I'm going to say this. It may be that with the autumn rains closing in, the moment of crisis caused by these Ukrainian offensives that were launched at the end of August may actually be passing. I mean, that's what many people have been saying up to now. And as I said, even the Financial Times appeared to concede this, at least about the effect of the autumn rains. And it may be that this is why these reserves are being held back and all of that. But in this kind of information situation, some explanation from senior Russian military officials as to what is actually going on, why they are so calm about a situation where they've had to make significant retreats, I think that would be helpful, if only to reassure domestic morale. Now, looking forward, there is the question of what is going to happen. And President Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, now said that 200,000 men have been inducted into the Russian military. Presumably another 100,000 are going to join them soon. There's apparently 70,000 volunteers already are also going to join up. We're getting lots of pictures of all of these forces now training in various parts of Russia. There's been some claims, as there was about the original mobilization, that the quality of training that some of these forces is getting is not particularly good. I've even seen one report that says only 20% of the troops are being trained to proper levels. I have to say, I am skeptical about that, and I would point out that the reservists who have been called up are people who overwhelmingly, are people who have served in the military before. So the kind of training they would be getting anyway would be sort of refresher training, I would have thought, rather than the whole range of training that you would expect people who've never had any experience of war to be receiving. So, I mean, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to speculate about this, but one way or the other, it looks as if forces of up to 400,000 men are being mobilized and prepared. I presume that is in order to achieve something. Interesting to see what eventually it is. But once that happens, it will certainly be more. It will mean that for the first time in the war, the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians on the battlefields. And that will, of course, should mark, I presume, a significant change in military dynamics. Now, one other point to make here about the situation in Ukraine, it's a minor one, but President Putin did make one other announcement today, or at least he didn't announce it himself. Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen government, he announced it. He's now been promoted to Colonel General, very senior rank in the Russian armed forces. Now, I am going to guess that this is an exercise of human management. Kadyrov made all kinds of criticisms of one particular Russian general, General Lapin, a few days ago in connection with the abandonment of Krasny Liman. And it seems that most of the military have supported Lapin. So if Lapin remains in post, as is likely, then in order to keep Kadyrov happy, it seems he's been given this promotion. So that's the kind of things that we see, but it does again emphasize that Kadyrov, in terms of Russian politics, not just in terms of conduct of the battlefields, is now very much a rising star. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefields. Let's move on to other things. And there's now growing evidence that this short period in the late summer and the summer and autumn of falling oil prices, that is now ending. And we get reports that OPEC Plus is gearing up for a significant oil production cut, something which apparently has the Biden administration extremely angry. President Biden went to Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, met the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, who's now also Saudi Arabia's Prime Minister, by the way. And though in the run-up to that visit, it was stressed that Biden would not talk about oil production issues, the reality is, as everybody knows, that the United States has been pushing the Saudis to increase oil production for some time, and instead they've chosen to cut it, and they're taking all of OPEC with them, and they've maintained their oil alliance with the Russians. Now, all of this is happening even as there's growing reports now that the weather in Europe is going to get significantly colder. It's been, I would say, at least in northwest Europe, in Britain where I am, a relatively normal autumn. Last autumn was extremely mild. The previous year, by the way, it had been unusually cold. This time, it's been neither especially cold nor especially warm. It's been a normal autumn. And that means, essentially, that the weather across Northern Europe is indeed becoming colder. Not just Northern Europe, but Europe generally. And I have to say that I've just seen a report from the meteorologists. Now, again, like everything else, there's so many other things that I have to write about and talk about. I am not a meteorologist. I'm absolutely not somebody who knows much about climate and about weather predictions. And I mean, but there are suggestions that a high pressure area may be forming over Europe in November and December. And that means much lower temperatures and much less wind. So if that's indeed the case, then in any normal scenario, energy use would be increasing significantly. How's that going to happen this time? Pipeline gas from Russia has basically come to a stop. There's still some gas flowing through Turk Stream and through some of the Ukrainian pipelines, but it's a trickle compared to what it was this time a year ago, and it's an even smaller trickle compared to what it would have been if Nord Stream 2 had come into operation. So there isn't much pipeline gas coming. I actually even read a report somewhere that the only EU member state that is still receiving pipeline gas from Russia is now Hungary. Moldova, which is of course not a member of the EU, is apparently facing a severe crisis with energy at the moment, precisely because gas flows to Moldova have practically stopped. Turk Stream still works. Turkey's still getting gas. There's some rumours, some talk that whoever it was who was responsible for sabotaging the Nord Stream pipelines might try to do the same thing with Turk Stream. I would say one thing: if it was the West, somebody in the West who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines, well, that would be a very easy thing to do, or so it seems to me, in the Baltic, in areas where Western navies are very powerful. But in the Black Sea, where Western navies are to all intents and purposes excluded, and where the Russian Black Sea Fleet has a predominant position, I think it might be much more dangerous. I think it would be significantly more complicated to do damage to Turk Stream than it would be to have done damage to Nord Stream. Anyway, that's my thought on that. But anyway, we'll see what happens. But regardless of that, there's far less pipeline gas than before. I think it's now become absolutely clear that hopes that there would be, convoys of LNG from the United States, that's not happening. And in fact, the indications are that with the midterms coming, the Biden administration wants to keep as much energy, home-produced energy, in the United States as possible in order to keep fuel prices, energy prices in the United States as low as possible. And that works against exporting LNG to Europe. And there are also some indications that China is now entering the fray, that they're going to increase their imports of oil and LNG over the next few weeks as they try to take steps to kickstart their economy after the party congress where President Xi Jinping was again confirmed essentially for a third term. So there may not be that much LNG, and of course if OPEC Plus starts cutting oil production, as everybody says, there might be less oil around. And to compound all of this, the EU is still plugging along with its policy of trying to stop or limit Russian oil imports. So it's still committed to ending imports of shipborne oil from Russia. That's supposed to come to an end, I believe, in December. The EU has been continuing to import large amounts of oil from Russia up to this point, but that's supposed to end in December. I'm sure a lot of oil from Russia will still reach the EU on ships, but of course it will be marketed as oil from other places, but of course it will be more expensive. So what happens? The other thing is, last point to say is, it seems that the period when the United States, the Biden administration, can continue to release oil from the US's strategic reserves, that's coming to an end as well. So I can't help but think that we're going to see not just a major increase in energy costs over the winter in Europe, and perhaps energy rationing and blackouts and all of those things, but massive further strains on European budgets, the budgets of European governments, as they struggle to cover these costs for their consumers to the extent that they can. A fact, by the way, which, as many people are now pointing out, Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism has a good piece about this. All that that's doing is, of course, sustaining demand, or at least supporting demand for a product which is becoming increasingly in short supply, increasing the prospects of shortages. So we see growing shortages, a growing crisis in energy in Europe, and I can't help but think that that's also going to feed further into rising inflation in Europe, and not just in Europe, but in the United States too. And on top of that, there's reports that the Ukrainian winter sowing season is at a third of the levels that it was last year, and growing evidence that the economic situation in Ukraine is deteriorating, by the way. But for the purpose of this video, it is the problems with the area of grain, the area of sowing, that this is having an effect. So food prices are likely to rise as well, also because of shortages. Let's repeat again, I don't get the sense that Western governments have a clear plan about what to do in this situation. I noticed that even The Economist is now talking about a crisis in the financial system, and that's a magazine which takes an extraordinarily orthodox, pro-Western position on pretty much any topic. So if this is true, we could be heading not just for a rocky winter in terms of fuel and energy shortages and higher inflation, but also for major problems in the financial system, the global financial system, or at least the Western financial system as well. Now, the problem with all of that is that it's not going to be solved if all that does happen. It doesn't end with the winter. One way or the other, we're looking at a difficult road ahead. So, to perhaps summarize what this video says, what the Russians would call a difficult situation on the battlefronts for Russia, but a government in Moscow that seems eerily calm. Some are starting to say disconnected, showing signs of being increasingly disconnected from the situations on the battlefields. I doubt that is the case, by the way. I'm sure that Putin is being briefed and is fully aware of what the situation on the battlefronts is. But at the moment, he doesn't seem to have a plan, at least not one I can see, except perhaps play for time. We'll see whether events over the next couple of hours give us any reason to change that. And a gathering economic crisis in the West, and again, no sign of a plan about what to do. Now, I would say that it does seem to me that President Putin's problems are easier to fix than the much more complex and intractable economic problems that we've been talking about. Though I would say that if President Putin has been gambling that the economic crisis in the West is going to solve his military and political problems for him in Ukraine by causing the West to dial down its support for Ukraine. I think that is a complacent view. But anyway, one way or the other, we will see what all of these governments now do. Well, thank you for joining me again today on in this further update of the situation on the battlefields and in the world economic situation. Things in this crisis get more complicated all the time. It's becoming, as I said, increasingly difficult to see clearly where all this is going. But no doubt we will get more answers fairly soon. In the meantime, remember, if you want to continue to listen to our platform, to our programs, you can find us also on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE and Telegram. And I would remind you that I do live streams on Locals, exclusively on Locals, every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. And if you want to put questions to me, you can join us on Locals. You can subscribe to our Locals channel and you can pose any questions to me that you wish. And also, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, you can check us. You can, if you want to support us, you can check your subscription to this channel, and you can also take the like button to this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.